Thank you, Xinguo. Good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute Regional Outlook Forum. It is the annual signature event of the Institute. It is my great pleasure this morning to introduce George Yeo as the keynote speaker of the morning session. Now, George Yeo needs no introduction, but I'd like to give him one. George Yeo is a thinker, a strategist, and a doer. I've worked with George as my minister in his 3 portfolios. Today, he will speak on transitions to a multipolar world. ASEAN's weakness is its strength. Now, George Yeo was a minister of the Ministry of Communications, Information, and the Arts. He did a great deal to elevate the arts scene, and tried to deal with the arts and information which deals with censorship, with nuance and sensitivity. He then became the Minister of Trade and Industry, and he was responsible for finding the pathways to fulfill the FTA strategy for Singapore, which enlarged Singapore's space, the economic space. And I recall George saying with a straight face, in the matter of free trade agreements, it is okay to be promiscuous. I think he did very well, and I worked with him for the United States-Singapore Free Trade Agreement when I was ambassador in the United States. He then took on the portfolio of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was foreign minister at a time of great transition. Actually, it was a particular inflection because the United States encountered the deep financial crisis, and we saw the rise of China. So it was a particularly sensitive time. Now, we know that George left politics because he lost the alternate election in the GE of 2011. But he has kept up his interest in political developments in Singapore, in the region, and in the world. Today, he is a visiting scholar at LKY, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. George is busy writing and publishing. He just published Musings, the first series. His second book is, by the way, is a trilogy. Yeah? And his second book, Musings 2, will be published and launched on February 16. So watch out for that. George, I have found out, is an excellent writer, and he just pulls you into the book and seduces you with his prose. Now, today, I will leave George to tell us about the transition to the multipolar world. ASEAN's weakness is its strength. George, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Heng Chi, for your kind introduction. Today, I want to talk about ASEAN's promiscuity. It's so nice to meet again, excellencies, old friends, old colleagues, friends of ISEAS. It's so nice to meet in person, and it makes a big difference. When we depend on reports, on videos, on Zoom exchanges, it's easy to stereotype the person on the other side, and sometimes to demonize him. But when we meet over a meal and receive a full range of information, the sharp edges soften. Then we realize again that in real life, we deal in shades of gray. China has relaxed its COVID restrictions dramatically. There'll be a couple more waves to come, but by next year, COVID will be a thing of the past. And the deeper trends, which were partly surfaced by COVID, will re-emerge more fully again. After the 20th Party Congress, the first visitor China received was the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party. I watched the video because you got to watch the video to get a better sense of what happened. He was received with the warmest of welcome. And the General Secretary, who's of slight build, he moved forward to embrace Xi Jinping, who's quite big. And after that, a friendship medal was given to him in a very carefully orchestrated ceremony. Both are of the chopsticks tradition, and both rely much on ritual and symbols to govern. Both were sending messages to their own people. Not long afterwards, in November, Singapore was for a brief period the center of the world. Not Singapore, I'm sorry. Singapore was the center for one day. Southeast Asia was for a brief period the center of the world. It began with the East Asian Summit in Phnom Penh, followed by the G20 Summit in Bali. Then there was the Bloomberg New Economy Conference in Singapore, and the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting in Bangkok. Xi Jinping was received like an emperor. In Jakarta, the welcome he received was above the welcome given to all other leaders. And there are lots of TikTok videos showing the contrast. Of course, it was because Xi Jinping had a state visit. But those of us who are in the MFA wallas, who are steep in the diplomatic trade, knows we choose whom to give a state visit to. And Xi Jinping was given a state visit in Jakarta and in Thailand. In Thailand, when he called on the king, it was not the usual calls on Thai kings. And I was told by a friend that when Xi Jinping left, it might have been an exaggeration, the entire Thai cabinet was there at the airport to send him off. Last week, when Ferdinand Marcos visited Beijing, both sides recall the role played by Imelda Marcos in 1971, when the young Ferdinand, as a teenager of 17-year-old, accompanied the mother. And he gave an interview to CCTV about that meeting with Mao Zedong. And he spoke with glowing terms about Mao Zedong and how awed he was in his presence. Now, if you are from Japan or US or Europe, you will be forgiven to think that Southeast Asia is in China's pocket. This is to misunderstand both Southeast Asia and China. Yes, there was a tributary relationship during the Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty. But it was a way of managing a complex relationship, and in some ways to keep each other at a friendly arm's length. In the Malay annals, the Sejarah Melayu, there is a delicious episode which is worth rereading. the Chinese emperor, Ming Dynasty, was sick. And the court physicians could not heal him, and it was getting worse. So he was feeling a bit desperate. And one day a court physician told him that there's one cure. You must send an envoy to Malacca to implore from the Sultan the used water from his foot bath. Get that water, bathe in it, and you'll be cured. Accordingly, an envoy was sent to Malacca. The request was made. The Sultan was sympathetic and deigned to allow his used foot water to be presented as a gift to the emperor. Now, you must understand the Hindu symbolism of this. Till today, when you address the Agong, it is di bawah duli yang maha mulia, below the great foot of the king. I mean, this is a very Hindu symbolism. So the emperor bathed in it, and he was cured. And after that, good relations prevailed between Malacca and China. There were 3 tribute missions recorded. And Malacca was under the strategic protection of China because of the Straits of Malacca, and kept Java and the Thais at arm's length. So even when Southeast Asians protest friendship with China, that relationship is softened by an excess of courtesy on both sides. I still remember vividly in 2002, when the ASEAN-China FTA framework agreement was signed in Phnom Penh. Zhu Rongji went off script, and they said to ASEAN leaders that China does not seek for itself an exclusive position in Southeast Asia. He understood the thinking of the people of Southeast Asia. Therefore, when other big powers see their presence in Southeast Asia as a zero-sum game, they are making a very big mistake. It does not mean that because we are close to China, we are not close to them. In fact, it is the opposite. The closer we are to China, the more we see our accounts growing, the more uncomfortable we are that our autonomy will be circumscribed. And therefore, we will welcome diversification. If the Americans do not insist on the choice, they are welcome in all corners of Southeast Asia. Japan has always been a friend. Europe, to me, is a free rider because the Europeans have no military presence here. Their interests are mostly economic. From time to time, they join an American alliance. But by and large, Europeans are welcome everywhere, despite the colonial history. And in fact, the colonial history, in some ways, has become a plus. As we enter a multipolar world, Southeast Asia will play an important role because of this history, this culture. We are the most diverse region in the world. Wang Gungwu once described Singapore as where the mandalas of India and China overlap. I would say that many mandalas overlap in Southeast Asia, not just China and India, but also the West and all the great religious traditions. And not just Buddhism and Christianity and Islam, but all the forms of Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam are in Southeast Asia. Every country has different degrees of overlap of these mandalas, giving each of the 10 countries its special character. But in all of them, we meet the same mandalas, but in different intensities. And it is these mandalas which connect us to the wider world and make us such a welcoming region. No foreigner feels unwelcome in Southeast Asia. I mean, it's not just the climate, it's not just the balmy atmosphere, but it is the culture, it is the food, it is the easy acceptance of those who are not like ourselves. This gives us a special position as the world enters into a troubled phase. The crystallization of multipolarity will take many years. The Americans are not comfortable because for a long time they are used to being dominant. The West is not comfortable because they're also used to Western dominance, of their values being universal, of judging others against their own standards. But it's changing. I mean, the rise of China is perhaps the most stark, and therefore seen as a challenge, even as a threat. But it is not just China. India has shown that it is a satellite of nobody. There was a hope for a time that with Quad, somehow India would be in the Western alliance. But the Ukraine war has shown that India plays its own game and will sit on as many tables as it wants to sit on. And this, in turn, have given hope to others that they too can be different. Russia, of course, has come to the conclusion that it cannot be a part of the West without being absorbed by the West. But Russia has its own origin, its own history, and it has deep links to Asia. How this struggle between the West and Russia will pan out, we do not know. But I think the Western alliance is noticing that those not of the West are not taking sides. Yes, we make pious remarks in the UN, and Singapore has imposed limited sanctions on Russia. By and large, the rest of the world isn't taking sides. In the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, there's a sense that this is going to be a different world, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and we are positioning ourselves for that world. It will be a world full of conflict because multipolarity is not naturally stable and is inherently dynamic because some poles are strengthening, some are weakening. So there'll be a need to meet, to talk, leave COVID behind us, meet each other as human beings, as brothers, and therefore resolve our differences. And in this world, I think ASEAN will play a very special role. It was very impressive the way President Jokowi handled a very tricky G20 because the Americans wanted Russia to be excluded. Of course, Russia could not be excluded. So Jokowi had to deftly handle a complicated field, which he did brilliantly. And then when they finally met in Bali, provided a milieu and atmosphere so friendly, so engaging, that even when leaders dislike one another, they had to smile at one another. And we recall how, for a brief moment, Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping engaged for maybe 1 minute. It was headline news all over India. I was told Modi might have contrived it because he's a skillful player of the media. But everyone else saw, everyone else drew conclusions. And this is the kind of role ASEAN plays. Not by interposing itself, by saying that we are right and you are wrong, and this is how the world should be, but just by being gracious, by showing respect, by nodding, by acknowledging, and in such a way, providing a solvent and emulsifier to break down divisions and make the region more comfortable, and hopefully the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. I didn't have to bring my glass.
I was afraid of that.
I poured water to get ready. Thank you very much. Now, the floor is yours, and to the organizers, I hope you'll allow us more time because we began 10 more minutes. Until 10 o'clock, okay. So the floor is yours, and can we have the first question? When you are asking your question, can you please just mention your name and the organization you are with, just so we know where the question comes from. Yeah, so the floor is yours. If you, the hand is up there, James Crabtree.
Thank you, George. James Crabtree from the IISS. That was a great overview. In this ballroom earlier this year, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida-san said that he thought Europe and Ukraine today could be East Asia's future tomorrow. I wonder if you could address in a little more detail what lessons you think the countries of Southeast Asia have taken out of the Ukraine war, and how the reality of that conflict might change the dynamics in this region.
Of course, all of us are fearful of US extraterritorial jurisdiction, and no company would likely want to be in infringement. But there is, leaving aside formal positions taken by governments, I think there is generally a sense that this is a distant war and doesn't really concern us. Big powers are involved. Better we don't take sides. For China, it is very important. China cannot afford Putin to lose, because then it'll be fully exposed. But China cannot condone the invasion either. So it has taken an intermediate position. I used to describe it as 60-40. 60% favoring Russia, but only 60%. After Xi Jinping's long meeting with Biden in Bali, I think they probably shifted to 55-57%. But China will never go below that, because it has a powerful strategic interest in keeping close to Russia, because for the coming years, it has to manage the US. And having Russia friendly is very important. Of course, China is also drawing lessons from the war, from its hybrid nature, and the weaponization of the global economic system, not just financial system, and what methods might be used should there be conflict one day between China and the US itself, including the weaponization of energy markets. The Chinese have not been engaged in wars, but they follow US wars very carefully, whether it was Iraq or Afghanistan, to learn lessons for themselves, preparing for the possibility that they one day may have to have some kind of a conflict with the US. India is 50-50. And I think it's a beneficiary from the Ukraine war. China is too, strategically. But India is in a very happy position of being able to eat on every table.
Right, another question? Yes, I see a gentleman, the hand's up over there.
Dilip Nair, Independent Director. Thank you, George, for a very elucidating talk. I wanted to ask this question about engendering trust between China and Southeast Asia. I think what you've shown, what you've talked about is in history. I think the relationship has been amicable. The question is going forward, and the issue that comes to mind is how negotiations on the code of conduct have gone on, or have not gone on actually for so long. And everybody knows that this is a flashpoint, the South China Sea. So how do you see this trust being engendered between China on one hand and Southeast Asia, or ASEAN on the other, vis-à-vis the code of conduct? Thank you.
Now, I believe in all meetings between China and Southeast Asian countries, there has been mutual expressions of hope that the code of conduct will be concluded soon. It requires give and take. I think in the case of the code of conduct, China should not be 50-50, which is wont to say, but it should be 60-40, to be on the generous side. And it requires artful diplomacy. And I hope that Indonesia, in the chair of ASEAN this year, can help to crystallize this agreement. It's very important, because otherwise the South China Sea will be weaponized by other great powers and cause inconvenience to us. We, of course, would like to use the great powers for our own negotiating purposes in ASEAN. But you know, it's a very dangerous game, because the moment we try to make use of them, we end up being on their chessboard.
Thank you. Yes, there's a hand. Yes, the lady at the back, yes.
Minister, thank you very much. I'm Sharon from the ASEAN Studies Center at ISEAS Yusof Ishak.
Can you speak louder, Sharon?
Yes, I'm Sharon from the ASEAN Studies Center at ISEAS Yusof Ishak. You've seen how the different powers have articulated their Indo-Pacific strategies. And last year, we've also seen that Canada and ROK have also jumped on the Indo-Pacific love boat. What do you make of this? And can you give a reading of how ASEAN can respond to the proliferation of these strategies? Thank you.
It is a game of words. The subtext is the degree of being anti-China in the formulation. The Japanese are careful to say that free means freedom of navigation. I think for the Americans, being free means you have to be democratic, which excludes China and Vietnam. The Europeans are maybe under some pressure from the Americans to give their view, so they try to interpolate without being too distant from the American position. In Southeast Asia, we've decided that we better assert our own position, which embraces and includes China. And that, of course, makes our formulation much less appealing to the other powers who view the Indo-Pacific idea as a way to, in some ways, to contain China. So this is a little game being played. It's not a matter about intellectual definitions. It's about what's below these definitions. And the fact is, the rest of China is altering the political field, strategic field in the entire region. And these are all responses.
I'm going to exercise the privilege of the chair to ask a question whilst people are thinking of further questions, because George, you made several interesting points in your presentation. And one of the points you made caught my attention, which is that multipolarity is dynamic and needs to meet and talk. People need to meet and talk. Who provides leadership in this? That's one question. Secondly, multipolarity, as I see it and as you've described it, we now, sees many players on the world stage: US, European Union, ASEAN, Japan, China, India, Middle East, Russia. But many of these poles coalesce together, United States and the European Union. And of course, the allies, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, are okay, Korea, and Russia and China to some extent. And you just have a few players sort of knocking around, free votes, as I would describe them. How does that modify your multipolarity? And is it real multipolarity?
Oh, I think depending on the
Two
issue,
questions. Yeah.
depending on the issue, we choose our friends and whom we are closer to. And there's no permanent circuitry. And this gives everybody more flexibility. And small guys like us in ASEAN, I mean, even Indonesia, which is big, is relatively small among the big powers. It gives us more room to play. And it's therefore a good thing for us. China, in its long history, has always dealt with multipolarity because it's got more borders with, it's got more neighbors than anybody else. And has always, it was never so dominant that it had no fear of its neighbors. In fact, the greatest strategic thinkers in China have all the time concentrated on China's strategic relationship with some of these neighbors who were either from the north or from the west, and more recently from the sea, but never from the south. The US doesn't like it, multipolarity, and is fighting it. My fear is it will exhaust itself fighting it, because it will fail. The US today has some 800 military bases around the world. They are very expensive. When I was invited to board a US aircraft carrier in Changi some years ago, there was a Singapore supplier of eggs. And I asked him how many eggs he was loading on board. He told me 2 million eggs. 2 million eggs. I thought he must have got a decimal point wrong, 1 zero too many. Then I calculated that for 100 days at sea, 5,000 sailors, 4 eggs a day, that's 2 million eggs. So there's a lot of money to be made by supplying US forces overseas. But who pays? It's a lot of money. Well, maybe some allies will cough up some, but the US taxpayer pays a lot. But all of us are also paying because of the US dollar. I mean, the US can print more money, so in the sense, the US dollar is a tax on all of us to help maintain Pax Americana in the world. At some point, when you weaponize the international financial system, an alternative will grow to displace it. Then at that point, the US dollar will lose this exorbitant privilege. Then the financing of military bases will be a hard choice between guns and butter, or the consequence will be inflation. When this will happen, no one knows, but financial markets must watch it very closely. So far, whenever there's a crisis, the US dollar goes up in value. When the day comes, the dollar not going up in value during a crisis, then we know a turning point has been reached. So it may be better for the US to help crystallize a multipolar world, because in a multipolar world, it will naturally be primus inter pares, the first among equals. And it's not just a matter of power. It is also the English language. It is also the standards and the conceptual categories which we've all been used to. In a way, diversity created the US in an earlier period. Europeans who felt oppressed went to a new continent, created a new society with a new liberal idea. But that liberal idea was mostly confined to Western civilization. It's now got to broaden to encompass people who are not Western in their history and civilizational origin. I mean, by 2050, by some estimates, 1 in 2 babies will be Muslim. 1 in 2 babies will be Muslim. So whether we like it or not, the world is going to change. And the multipolar world, to me, it's on the cards. It's already been born. It's growing up. And the quicker the US and maybe the collective West grasp this and work to shape it, the better they are to preserve their position, and in a positive way, not in a negative way. I always ask myself, if one day we have to go to outer space, whose operating system will we use? American, Chinese, Indian, French, German? I think it'd be closer to the American system because it's a system which was built for diversity and less reliant on history, but more on law to organize people. But it requires a fresh interpretation of the liberal idea in the US, which will itself take a long time. So in this transition, there'll be a lot of problems for all of us.
Thank you. Actually, George, that was a second question, which was, who do you see providing leadership to help, multipolarity, the different poles, meet and talk?
The US will have to provide the leadership because I don't see China providing the leadership. The Chinese system is designed for the Chinese system, for Chinese people. You take, say, COVID controls. China's methods could not be used anywhere else, not even in Singapore. Only the Chinese people who, despite all their complaints, will in the end still comply because they know the alternative is a breakup of the social order with huge consequences for generations. So there is an instinct for collective discipline. The Chinese system cannot be a universal system. The West would like to think that its system is universal. I think it can only be if it grows a bigger heart and a bigger mind. But that will take time. And it involves first attention and a challenge.
Thank you.
But of course, Southeast Asia, in our inimitable way, can provide a platform. Recently NASA said China is going to take over the resources of the moon because water is found in certain parts of the moon, and the Chinese seems to be targeting those parts of the moon to explore. Of course, one of NASA's objectives is to get more money from the US Congress. But let's think about it. In the coming decades, human beings will colonize the moon and Mars. And will we have to carry our weapons to the moon and to Mars because we fear each other? Or will we recover the wisdom with respect to Antarctica when many decades ago there was an agreement that it will not be weaponized and the resources of Antarctica will be shared? So we need to begin a conversation about the moon and Mars, and not too long from now. If anyone were to propose, there will immediately be suspicions because each is eyeing the other suspiciously. But maybe ASEAN can very naturally, without arrogance, without excessive cleverness, surface certain ideas for conversation and let it coalesce, let it sprout naturally. In a small way, Singapore played a big role in UNCLOS. Prof. Tommy Koh played a very important role in putting UNCLOS together, which at that time seemed like an impossible task. We should do something for outer space.
Thank you. Are there further questions?
I think there's someone there.
Yes, please.
Thank you, sir, and ISEAS for the opportunity. I'm a student from NTU RSIS. My name is Suresh. The question is multipolarity healthy for emerging nations, rising middle powers in Southeast Asia? The basis of my question is on 3 supporting points. As mentioned earlier, unipolar has showed stable growth, but also showed a lack of stability in an economic crisis, so it's not a guaranteed model. A bipolar model has created a healthy competition for rising nations. In fact, our founding fathers saw the opportunities in China and engaged China to lay the groundwork for this. But with a multipolar world, Southeast Asian nations risk losing ASEAN centrality, as rising powers may have to choose sides such as cooperation, a level of cooperation with Russia in the current conflict. As our former PM, Goh Chok Tong, had said, ASEAN is like a pilot with with world powers, big powers on their wings. So the point is, ASEAN is not structured like the EU to keep Southeast Asia in a healthy economic competition, while keeping, at the same time, aligned to a political view of the international system. So is multipolar world or multipolarity healthy for rising nations in Southeast Asia, sir?
Will we lose our centrality?
No, Southeast Asia has always been used to multipolarity. No kingdom or empire in Southeast Asia was ever strong enough to unify all of Southeast Asia or to threaten anybody else. In fact, major powers have always radiated their influences into Southeast Asia. So surviving in a multipolar world is in the DNA of Southeast Asia. It's in the DNA of ASEAN. And therefore gives ASEAN a special role, a unique role, as the world becomes multipolar. ASEAN centrality, we must not be too self-satisfied. You know, the major powers would like to say, oh, we acknowledge ASEAN centrality. We want ASEAN to be in the driver's seat. It's not because they think very highly of us. In fact, sometimes they're just patronizing us. Internally, they say it a snigger. But somehow, when they have to meet, they are better ASEAN than anywhere else. It was not an accident that Trump met Kim Jong-un, first time, second time, in Southeast Asia. And at the ASEAN Regional Forum, despite all the antagonisms, the US, Russia, China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, Europe, everybody else sit around the same table, and are required by an ASEAN host to talk to each other in a civilized way. And we never try to campur tangan and be clever, you know, and tell them what to do. We just say, no, let's talk. The conversations may be unproductive, but it's still important to talk, because it's only by talking and by meeting personally that we gain deeper understandings and become more subtle and more appropriate in our reactions.
Thank you. Do I see a hand anywhere else?
Yes, one in front here.
Where? Oh, please.
Thank you, Mr. Yeo. My name is Hiro Ishizaka with Mitsubishi Corporation. I have a question with regard to more, let's say, domestic issues in regional countries. I think it's often said that foreign policy or external relationship is driven by domestic issues. So moving forward, do you see any, let's say, specific issues or topics in regional countries that may affect regional relationships?
Sorry, domestic issues affecting regional relationships?
Yes, because domestic issues have an effect on, let's say, external relationships or foreign policy.
In the region.
Well, I think for all countries, we've got to solve the internal problem and external challenges as simultaneous equations. You can't solve one without the other, because without the world, you can't survive. But there's no point talking about the world if internally we're in a mess. I would say the smaller you are, the more you have to take into account external relationships, because that's a larger part of your life. But if the whole world were one country, then of course there's no external relationship. Then all politics is domestic. So from that viewpoint, the size of a country matters. So for Indonesia, its domestic politics must dominate. But for a tiny country like Singapore, as a city-state, we spend a lot of our time, we allocate a large part of our gray matter to managing external relations, because our life depends on it. Yeah. But that is talking in the abstract. If you look at the problem of Myanmar, because of the Rohingya issue, Muslim countries in Southeast Asia, partly in response to their domestic public, take a certain position. I think this is not always wise. If we handle Myanmar as an external party, the way others do, then we have little ability to influence what goes on within. And if something goes wrong in Myanmar, ASEAN will be gravely affected. Myanmar, which fails, will inevitably, because of its strategic position, draw in major powers. Then we'll get sucked in and lose influence. To me, it's very important to deal with Myanmar early and not let the problem get too bad. It will never be a perfect solution. But we've had decades of experience dealing with the Burmese army, called the Tatmadaw, and how to save their face, but at the same time, when they're in the room, express our deep unhappinesses to them. But we have to save their face to their own people, because otherwise, they will feel weakened, and therefore they cannot engage us. Now, this requires a lot of subtle play and shifting admixture of hard and soft measures. We have not been too successful so far. And here again, I'd like to express my hope that Indonesia, and the chair of ASEAN, will be creative and find a way, given the fact that Myanmar will be holding elections, however you may describe them, quite soon. And if ASEAN is not involved, then the elections will be of no use. If ASEAN is involved, is it only a fig leaf? I don't think we can forget Daw Suu and the terrible way she has been treated. She has to be a part of the solution. She was part of the problem, but she has got to be a part of the solution, without which there is no good future for Myanmar. And without a good future for Myanmar, our own future in ASEAN will be adversely affected.
Thank you. Any further questions on Myanmar? Any other questions? Yes, I see a hand there. Manu, yes, ask her.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you, Mr. Yeo. My question is picking up on the point you raised that if we can't get our own act together, then we can't deal with all the problems. So talking about ASEAN, would you agree that there seems to be a growing fundamental divergence of interests between the northern part of ASEAN, which is increasingly under the gravitational pull, economic and so on of China, and the rest of ASEAN, and that over time that this divergence may grow, and if it is not managed, would ASEAN then become weaker and less able to do all the good things that hopefully we could have done? Thank you.
I don't see China causing a divergence in ASEAN, because archipelagic Southeast Asia also wants very good relations with China, and these relations are valued by with China, and these relationships are valued by China. I see ASEAN actually becoming stronger. In terms of policy coordination, sometimes we are strong, sometimes we are weak. But if you look at lower down, with a finer granularity between universities, think tanks, companies, I think all of us are appreciating the region more. And it is not because of our will. I think it's because it is natural. We only became divided when the European powers came, carved us up, and connected us to the metropolitan centers in Europe. So when I was young, I was in primary school in St. Patrick's, which at that time had a beach. And one day the teacher pointed to the horizon and said, "That's Indonesia." And all of us wooed and ahed as if, wow, terra incognita. Why was it terra incognita? Because of British textbooks. It should never be terra incognita, because they are our immediate neighbors. We are part of the realms. So going back to the pre-colonial past, when people move up and down these waterways, should be what is natural to us. Yeah. So I don't see us getting more divided. I see us getting more united. But of course, there are things that we can do, like singing the ASEAN, like teaching our children the ASEAN anthem, which is one of my bugbears.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, when I was foreign minister, when I had some time, I committed it to memory and I learned to sing it to myself so that at ASEAN functions I can sing it without reference to a script. So I tried to get my diplomats to learn it. They are all wasting time. I tried to get my education ministry to teach it to school children. They say they're so busy, do we really want to load this on them? If school kids in Singapore all sing the ASEAN anthem, I think the Malaysians, the Indonesians will feel under pressure to teach their own children. And before you know it, everybody in ASEAN will teach their children how to sing the ASEAN anthem. And that can only be a plus. But this is a bugbear. So I never miss an opportunity to say it publicly.
Well, thank you very much, George. But actually, the ASEAN anthem hasn't got a very singable tune. You know?
No,
so we've got to really reinvent the song.
The pitch can be lowered. It can be lowered.
Well, thank you very much, George. We've come to the end of the first session, and I think George Yeo has helped us explore the concept of multipolarity in a very full way and to think through the roles of the great powers of the US, of China, and and the smaller players as well. And in the process, we've touched on so many other issues and on the role and potential of ASEAN. And I thank him for his unflagging belief and faith in the strength of ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you, Ng Chi.
Please join.